You know, there's something rather peculiar that happens to certain people. They wake up one morning and catch a glimpse of themselves in the mirror, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, they don't recognize the person staring back. Not physically, mind you. They know their own face, but something else feels off. Like they're looking at a stranger performing the role of their life. And we've been told, haven't we, that we must maintain this thing we call ourselves, that we must constantly reinforce our identity, defend our character, prove our worth. Build yourself up, they say. Be consistent. Have a strong sense of self. Know who you are and never waver from it. But I want to suggest something quite different to you today. That this very project, this constant construction and maintenance of the person you call you, might be the most exhausting thing you'll ever do. And more than that, it might be completely unnecessary. Now, I'm not speaking of self-improvement or becoming a better person. I'm speaking of something far more fundamental and far more radical. I'm talking about the entire enterprise of selfhood itself, the continuous feeding of an illusion that you've somehow agreed is real. Have you ever stopped to notice how much energy it takes to be you? Really notice. Every morning you wake up and immediately begin the process of reconstruction. You remember your preferences, your opinions, your likes and dislikes. You recall your story, the narrative of who you've been and who you're becoming. You put on not just your clothes, but your personality, your way of speaking, your characteristic gestures, your typical responses. It's quite remarkable when you think about it. You're essentially performing yourself, and the performance must be consistent enough that everyone, including you, believes it's the real thing. But here's where the danger begins, because this performance requires constant feeding, constant reinforcement, like a fire that must be continuously stoked or it will go out. And you've become so skilled at stoking this fire, so automatic in your feeding of this illusion, that you've forgotten you're doing it at all. Let me tell you what I mean. Think of it this way. You have ideas about yourself, don't you? I'm the kind of person who values honesty. I'm someone who doesn't tolerate disrespect. I'm an introvert or an extrovert or an anxious person or a confident one. These aren't just casual observations. These are declarations, proclamations of identity. And once you've made them, once you've announced to yourself and the world who you are, you become trapped in maintaining them. Every situation you encounter becomes a test, an opportunity to prove that yes, you are indeed who you claim to be. If you've decided you're honest, you must display honesty even when a small lie would cause no harm. If you've decided you're confident, you must perform confidence even when you feel terrified. If you've decided you're a victim of your past, you must continue finding evidence that your past is still victimizing you. The first danger, then, is exhaustion. And I don't mean the ordinary tiredness of a long day. I mean something far more profound. The bone-deep weariness of maintaining a fiction 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year, until the day you die. You're like an actor who can never leave the stage, never remove the costume, never speak in their own voice, because you've forgotten there's anything other than the performance. You've become so identified with the role that you've lost contact with whatever might exist beyond it. I once knew a man, let's call him David, who had spent 40 years building an identity as the successful businessman, the confident leader, the man who had it all figured out. He wore expensive suits, drove the right car, said the right things at the right moments, and everyone believed it, including him. Until one day, quite suddenly, his business collapsed. Not through any fault of his own, mind you. The market shifted, circumstances changed, and within 6 months, everything he'd built was gone. And you know what happened? He fell apart completely. Not because he'd lost his money, though that was difficult. Not because he'd lost his status, though that stung. But because he'd lost the only version of himself he knew how to be. Without the business, without the props and costumes of success, he had no idea who he was. The illusion had been fed for so long that when it couldn't be fed anymore, there seemed to be nothing left. He told me once, "I look in the mirror and I don't know who's looking back. Everything I thought I was just a story I was telling. And now the story doesn't work anymore." And here's the second danger. When you've invested everything in maintaining a particular version of yourself, You become terrified of anything that threatens it. Any experience, any person, any situation that might reveal the illusion for what it is becomes an enemy to be defended against. This is why people react so strongly when their identity is challenged. Why someone might become enraged when their intelligence is questioned if they've built their sense of self around being smart. Why someone might fall into despair when they fail at something if they've constructed an identity around being competent. Why someone might panic when rejected if they've decided they're lovable and worthy. It's not really about the intelligence or the competence or the worthiness. It's about the fact that these challenges threaten to expose the underlying truth. That the whole thing is a construction, a story, an illusion continuously fed and reinforced. You defend your self-concept like a nation defending its borders. Any invasion must be repelled. Any threat must be neutralized. And you use all sorts of strategies to do this. You surround yourself with people who reflect back the version of yourself you want to believe in. You avoid situations where you might be revealed as something other than what you claim. You interpret every experience through the filter of your existing self-concept, bending reality to fit your story, rather than allowing reality to show you something new. And when something does threaten to break through, when reality insists on showing you that you're not quite who you think you are, you have an arsenal of defensive maneuvers ready. Rationalization, denial, projection, blame, justification. All of these are ways of feeding the illusion, of keeping the story intact, of making sure that the version of you that you've been maintaining doesn't have to change or dissolve or be questioned too deeply. But here's what nobody tells you. The third danger is perhaps the most insidious. The more energy you put into maintaining this illusion, the more rigid it becomes. The more defended your sense of self, the less alive you feel. Because life, real life, is fluid. It's constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly presenting new experiences that don't fit neatly into your predetermined categories. But you, with your fixed sense of self, you're trying to be consistent, predictable, the same person you were yesterday and the day before and the day before that. You're essentially trying to be a static object in a dynamic universe. And this creates a terrible tension. I remember years ago sitting with a woman who was suffering terribly. Not from any external circumstance. Her life was actually quite good. She had health, relationships, meaningful work. But she was in agony nonetheless. And as we talked, it became clear what was happening. She had decided somewhere along the way that she was a spiritual person, someone evolved, someone who had transcended petty emotions like anger or jealousy or pettiness. But of course, she still felt these things. She was human after all. But every time these unspiritual emotions arose, she had to suppress them, deny them, pretend they weren't there, because they didn't fit the image of herself she'd been feeding. So she was at war with herself, part of her experiencing normal human emotions, and another part frantically trying to maintain the illusion that she was beyond such things. And the energy this took, the constant surveillance of her own experience, the endless editing and suppressing and denying, it was destroying her from the inside out. This is what happens when you feed the illusion too well. You become trapped in it. You must constantly police your own experience to make sure nothing arises that contradicts the story you've been telling. And here's the fourth danger, the one that most people never see. When you're completely identified with this constructed self, when you believe absolutely that you are the story you've been telling, you miss the most extraordinary thing. You miss the fact that there's an awareness underneath all of it, a consciousness that exists prior to the construction of identity, a presence that's aware of the story without being the story itself. Right now, as you're reading this, there's something in you that's aware of these words, something that's thinking about these ideas, something that's experiencing whatever emotions or reactions are arising. But that awareness, that presence, is it the same as the person you think you are? Is it the same as your name, your history, your personality, your characteristics? Or is it something else entirely? Something that exists before and beyond all of these constructions? Most people never ask this question. They're so busy feeding and maintaining and defending their sense of self that they never notice there's something watching the whole performance. Something that was there before they started building their identity and will be there after they stop. This is the great tragedy. You're so invested in maintaining an illusion that you miss the reality that's always been present. You're so busy being the person you think you are that you never discover what you actually are underneath all the stories and constructions and performances. Now, you might be thinking, well, this all sounds rather frightening. If I'm not the person I think I am, then who am I? And if I stop feeding this illusion, won't I just disappear? Won't I become nothing? And here's where we come to something interesting. Because the fear you're feeling right now, that fear of dissolution, that terror of losing yourself, that's part of the illusion too. The constructed self, the ego, the identity you've been feeding, it knows its own nature. It knows somewhere deep down that it's not real, that it's a story, a construction, a convenient fiction. And so it lives in constant fear of being exposed, of being revealed as the illusion it is. This is why the ego is so defensive, so reactive, so desperate to maintain itself. It's fighting for its survival, and it uses your fear as its primary weapon. It says, if you stop maintaining me, you'll cease to exist. If you stop feeding me, there will be nothing left. If you let me go, you'll be lost, empty, meaningless. But here's the paradox. The thing you're afraid of losing isn't real to begin with. Let me give you an image. Imagine you're watching a movie, completely absorbed in the story. The characters feel real to you. Their struggles matter. Their victories and defeats affect you emotionally. And then suddenly, the film breaks. The image disappears from the screen, and you're sitting in a dark theater, aware of yourself as the audience member you actually are. Did you cease to exist when the movie stopped? Did you disappear when the illusion ended? Or did you simply wake up to what was real all along? This is what happens when you stop feeding the illusion you call you. You don't disappear. You wake up. You discover that what you actually are is not the character in the movie, not the person in the story, not the constructed identity you've been maintaining. What you actually are is the awareness that's been watching the whole performance. But here's what I've learned. The danger I'm describing is only dangerous when it's unconscious. When you're feeding the illusion without knowing you're doing it. When you believe absolutely in the reality of the constructed self and defend it with everything you have. Once you see it, once you recognize the game you've been playing, everything changes. Not because you stop being a person in the world, not because you stop having preferences or characteristics or ways of being, but because your relationship to all of it transforms. You begin to hold your identity lightly, like a costume you put on for the day but can remove at night. Like a role you play when it's useful, but don't confuse with who you actually are. And here's the relief in this. The profound, life-changing relief. You realize you don't have to maintain it anymore. You don't have to constantly feed and defend and prove and justify. You can let the whole exhausting project go. Think of it this way. Imagine you've been carrying a heavy backpack for so long that you've forgotten you're carrying it. The weight has become normal. Your shoulders are permanently tensed. Your back permanently aching, but you don't even notice anymore. This is just how life feels. And then someone points to the backpack and says, you know you can take that off, don't you? And at first you're confused. Take it off? But this is part of me. I've always carried this. Who would I be without it? But then, tentatively, you unbuckle the straps. You let it slide off your shoulders. And the relief is so profound you almost want to cry. You had no idea how heavy it was until you put it down. You had no idea how much freedom you'd feel without it. This is what happens when you stop feeding the illusion. The weight you've been carrying, the burden of constant self-maintenance, it just lifts. And you discover that you can still function, still interact, still live your life, but without all the exhausting effort of continuously constructing and defending a sense of self. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not suggesting you become a blank slate or that you have no characteristics or preferences. The person you've been expressing in the world can continue to express. But the difference is identification. Before, you believed you were that person. Now, you recognize that these are simply patterns, tendencies, learned behaviors that arise and express themselves through the organism you call your body. But they're not who you fundamentally are. You're the space in which all of this appears. The awareness that knows the personality without being limited to the personality. And this makes all the difference, because when you're not defending a fixed sense of self, you become fluid, responsive, alive in a way that rigid identity never allows. You can be confident in one situation and uncertain in another without it threatening your sense of self. You can be competent at some things and completely useless at others without feeling diminished. You can be liked by some people and disliked by others without taking it personally, because there's no longer a fragile construction that needs protecting. There's just experience, arising and passing, without the constant need to make it mean something about who you are. I've watched people undergo this shift, and it's quite remarkable. They don't become less themselves. They often become more fully themselves. But there's a lightness to it, a playfulness, a freedom that wasn't there before. They stop taking themselves so seriously, not because they don't care, but because they've seen through the game. They've recognized that all the Sturm und Drang of maintaining and defending their identity was never necessary to begin with. Let me tell you about a woman I knew. Let's call her Margaret. She had spent her entire life being the good daughter, the responsible one, the person everyone could count on. And she'd constructed her entire sense of self around this role. But when her mother died, something shifted. Without the person she'd been being good for, without the one she'd been being responsible to, the whole identity started to crumble. And instead of frantically trying to rebuild it, instead of immediately finding someone new to be good for, she did something radical. She stopped. She sat with the dissolution. She allowed the illusion to collapse. And for a while, she told me, she felt completely lost, empty, like she'd disappeared. But she stayed with it. She didn't run. She didn't immediately construct a new identity to replace the old one. And gradually, something else emerged. Not a new version of herself, not Margaret 2.0, but a recognition that she'd never needed the construction to begin with. That underneath all the performing and maintaining and proving, there had always been a simple presence. An awareness that didn't need to be anything in particular to be perfectly complete. She still acted responsibly when appropriate. She still showed up for people who needed her. But it wasn't coming from a desperate need to prove her identity. It was just natural responsiveness to life as it presented itself. And the freedom she felt, the lightness, it was like being released from a prison she'd been in for so long, she'd forgotten there were walls. So here we are at the heart of it. The illusion you call you requires constant feeding, constant maintenance, constant defense. And this is exhausting. This creates suffering. This keeps you trapped in a rigid, defended, anxious relationship with life. But it doesn't have to. Not if you're willing to see the illusion for what it is. Not if you're willing to stop feeding it, even temporarily, and discover what remains when the construction dissolves. And I know what you're thinking. This sounds wonderful in theory. But how do you actually do it? How do you stop feeding an illusion that you've been feeding your entire life? Well, it starts with simple observation. Just watching. Noticing when you're constructing yourself, when you're defending yourself, when you're feeding the story of who you think you are. Notice when someone challenges your identity and you feel that surge of defensiveness. Notice when you're about to do something purely to maintain your self-image. Notice when you're editing your experience to fit your story about yourself. Just notice. Don't judge it. Don't try to stop it. Just see it clearly. Because here's the thing. The very act of observing the illusion begins to weaken it. When you watch yourself constructing your identity, you're no longer fully identified with it. There's a space opening up. A gap between the awareness that's watching and the identity that's being constructed. And in that gap, something else becomes possible. A way of being that doesn't depend on maintaining a fixed sense of self. A responsiveness to life that arises naturally without the constant need to filter everything through. What does this say about me? You start to see that life is much simpler than you thought. Situations arise, responses happen. None of it needs to be made into a statement about your identity. Someone criticizes you? It's just words in the air. It doesn't need to be received as an attack on your self-concept. You can hear it or ignore it or consider it without the whole drama of defending who you think you are. You fail at something? It's just an outcome. It doesn't need to mean that you're a failure. The event happened. The identity you attach to it is optional. You succeed at something? Wonderful. Enjoy it. But you don't need to use it as proof of your worth or evidence of your identity. It's just an experience passing through. This doesn't make you cold or detached. Quite the opposite. When you're not constantly defending and maintaining a sense of self, you become more present, more available, more genuinely responsive to what's actually happening rather than to how it might affect your self-image. And here's what I've learned. The peace that comes from this is unlike anything else, because it's not the peace of having everything under control. It's not the peace of having successfully defended your identity against all threats. It's the peace of recognizing that you've never needed to defend anything to begin with. The constructed self, the illusion you've been feeding. It's like a security system designed to protect something that was never in danger. The awareness that you actually are, the consciousness that's reading these words right now, it doesn't need protecting. It was never threatened. It can't be diminished or destroyed. All the energy you've been spending on maintaining and defending your sense of self, it was always unnecessary. Like staying awake all night to guard a house that's already perfectly safe. And when you realize this, when you really see it, the relief is extraordinary. You can finally relax. Finally stop the exhausting project of being someone. Finally just be. But here's the paradox within the paradox. When you stop trying so hard to be someone, when you stop feeding the illusion, you often discover that the genuine qualities you thought you'd lose actually become more available. Real confidence emerges, not the performed confidence of someone trying to prove they're confident. Real compassion arises, not the constructed compassion of someone who's decided they're a compassionate person. Real strength shows up, not the defended strength of someone maintaining an image of being strong. These qualities are natural. They're part of what you actually are underneath the construction, but they were being blocked by all your effort to perform them, to prove them, to make them into statements about your identity. When you relax the construction, when you stop feeding the illusion, these qualities can flow naturally without all the contrivance and effort. And perhaps most importantly, you start to recognize the same struggle in everyone around you. You see that everyone is doing this same exhausting thing. Everyone is feeding their own illusion, defending their own constructed self, maintaining their own story. And this creates compassion. Not pity, not superiority, but genuine compassion born from recognizing the universal human condition. Everyone is trapped in this same project of being someone, and it's wearing everyone out. When you see this, you stop taking people's defensiveness personally. You recognize that when someone attacks you, they're usually defending their own illusion, not responding to who you actually are. When someone needs to prove themselves, to perform their identity, you can see the exhaustion underneath it. And sometimes, just sometimes, your presence becomes a space where others can relax their own performance, where they don't have to be anyone in particular, where they can let the construction rest for a moment and remember what it feels like to just be. This is the gift you can offer when you've stopped feeding your own illusion, not by teaching or preaching or telling anyone what to do, but simply by being someone who's no longer engaged in the exhausting project of constant self-construction. So here we are at the end, and perhaps at the beginning. The illusion you call you has been fed for a long time, maybe your whole life. And it won't dissolve overnight just because you've read these words. But you can begin. You can start to notice. You can catch yourself in the act of construction, of defense, of feeding the story. And in those moments of noticing, something shifts. The identification loosens. The grip relaxes. The exhausting effort becomes visible, and in becoming visible, it becomes optional. You don't have to be anyone. You never did. That's the great cosmic joke. All this effort, all this striving, all this defending and maintaining and proving, it was always unnecessary. What you actually are, the awareness underneath all the construction, it's already complete, already whole, already perfectly fine exactly as it is. And when you discover this, when you really see it, you realize you've been free all along. You just didn't know it. You were too busy feeding an illusion to notice the reality that was always present. The danger of maintaining the illusion is real. The exhaustion is real. The suffering is real. But so is the possibility. The possibility that you'll see through it, that you'll stop feeding it, that you'll discover what remains when the construction falls away. And what remains is not nothing. It's not emptiness in the negative sense. It's the fullness of being without the weight of becoming. It's consciousness without the burden of maintaining a self-concept. It's life flowing naturally, without the constant interference of me, trying to control and direct it all. And perhaps, if you're fortunate, you'll find others who've seen this too. Others who've stopped feeding their own illusion. Others who can be with you without the constant dance of defended identities bumping into each other. When you find these people, when you can finally just be together without the performance, that's when you realize what was lost in all that construction. The simple joy of presence. The ease of being with another, without all the exhausting effort of being someone in particular. This is the hope within the danger, that you'll tire of feeding the illusion before it drains you completely, that you'll see through the construction while there's still energy left to enjoy what remains, that you'll discover the freedom that was always available underneath the prison you built for yourself. The illusion will offer you many reasons why you need to keep feeding it. It will tell you that you'll disappear without it, that you'll be nothing without it, that life will be meaningless without it. But these are just more stories, more constructions, more illusions feeding the central illusion. The truth is simpler and more profound. You are not the story. You never were. And you can stop performing the role anytime you choose. The question is only whether you'll have the courage to put down the backpack, to stop the performance, to let the illusion starve rather than continue feeding it with your precious life energy. And that, my friends, is entirely up to you. No one can do it for you. No one can force you to see what you're not ready to see. But the possibility is always there, waiting. The freedom is always available underneath the construction. All you have to do is stop. Just for a moment. Stop feeding the illusion and see what remains. You might be surprised to discover that what remains is far more real, far more alive, and far more you than the illusion you've been maintaining ever was.